They took the house. They took the car. They took every dollar their father spent 40 years saving. Then they handed their own mother a cardboard box of old inventory sheets, like it was a party favour. "It's the best we can do," her son said. He didn't even look up. Then they told her to wait until Friday. For a bed. In the house she used to own. She said nothing. She went to the box. 3 weeks later, a lawyer opened an envelope. None of them had ever checked it. The room went so quiet you could hear the radiator tick. But before the lawyer, there was the doorway. Before the doorway, there was the funeral. Before that, 31 years, nobody in that family had bothered to add up right. Eleanor Voss stood in the doorway of what used to be her own guest room. She held a suitcase. It held everything she owned. Her son's wife was talking, not looking up from her phone, explaining that the room was cluttered. She'd have to wait until Friday. "There's boxes in there, Eleanor," Deborah said. "Walter's old files, mostly. I haven't sorted it. Just give it till Friday." Eleanor was 68. She'd raised 2 boys in this house, canned tomatoes in that kitchen every August for 31 years. Now she stood in the hallway holding a suitcase, like a woman waiting on a bus that might not come. She didn't set the suitcase down. She'd learned that much feeding 1,100 kids a day for 31 years. When someone hands you a delay instead of an answer, keep your hands free. "Where should I go until Friday?" Eleanor asked. Deborah finally looked up. 42. Pretty in the tight, scheduled way of a woman who ran her whole life on a calendar. She'd married Eleanor's older son Roger 14 years back, in a church 2 towns over that Eleanor had helped pay for. "There's Millie's," Deborah said. "Or the Sterling House does a weekly rate." I looked it up. Not bad. She said it like she was recommending a restaurant. Eleanor didn't answer. She looked past the hallway, into the kitchen, at the stove. Not her stove anymore, technically. Not since the reading 3 weeks back. But her hand still knew every burner. Which one ran hot? Which one you had to wiggle to light? She walked over and picked up the dish towel off the oven handle. Wiped a counter that didn't need wiping. 31 years of feeding other people's children had taught her one true thing. A clean counter buys you 30 seconds to think. Sometimes 30 seconds is all you get. "I'll go to Millie's," Eleanor said when she was done. She folded the towel back, squared to the edge, picked the suitcase back up. She didn't slam the door. A woman who's fed 1,100 children a day for 31 years doesn't slam doors. She just remembers who didn't open one. But that came second. First came the funeral. Mill Haven, Pennsylvania sat on a bend of the Allegheny, where the paper mill once ran 3 shifts and now ran 1.5. 4,000 people. 1 hardware store. A lot of memory. Eleanor had lived on Cutter's Ridge Road for 39 years. White clapboard house. A porch facing the ridge. She'd lived it with a man named Walter Voss, who ran Voss Hardware on Front Street from the year they married until the morning. 8 months before that doorway, his heart just stopped behind the register. He was 69. He'd been ringing up a box of 10-penny nails for Harlan Doyle, who farmed 40 minutes north and drove in every second Tuesday. Harlan said later that Walter told him, "That'll be $4.11. Then he was on the floor. By the time the ambulance made it up Front Street, the store was already dark inside. Nobody had thought to leave the lights on. Eleanor didn't scream at the funeral. She stood at the front of Mill Haven Presbyterian in a navy dress she'd bought for her sister's funeral 11 years before. She shook 200 hands, thanked people for casseroles she wouldn't eat. When her younger son Curtis put his arm around her in the receiving line, she leaned into it. 4 seconds. Then she straightened back up, because there were people behind him. Her older son Roger stood on the other side of the casket. Suit fit him too well for a man who'd leased his car 2 years running and remortgaged his own house that spring. Roger was 44, regional sales manager for a fastener company. He'd told his mother more than once that Mill Haven was a town you left, not a town you stayed in. A strange thing to say at his father's funeral, in the town he'd never quite left far enough behind. Walter had run that store for 31 years. In the last 4, he'd done something none of his sons knew about. Something he'd never told Eleanor either. Not directly, only in the shape of a sentence he said a dozen times those final years, usually closing the register on a Friday, counting the drawer twice before he'd trust the total. "Count the nails twice, Ellie," he'd say, sliding the tray shut. "The register's only ever wrong once." She thought it was just a thing he said, a shop habit that turned into a marriage habit. The kind of sentence a man repeats until it stops meaning anything and just means him. She didn't know, standing at his funeral, that the sentence would matter again. Later. In a lawyer's office. In a way she couldn't yet picture. In the 9 days between the funeral and the reading, Eleanor did what she'd always done. She got up early, made coffee for one, out of a pot built for two, because she couldn't yet bring herself to buy a smaller one. She walked the Ridge house room to room some mornings, not cleaning exactly, just touching things. Walter's reading chair by the window, his boots still by the back door, mud dried hard into the tread from some errand he'd run the week before he died. The town brought casseroles the way small towns do. Eleanor accepted everyone at the door, thanked every person by name and gave most of it away within a week, because a woman can only eat so much tuna noodle bake before it starts to taste like grief itself. She kept one dish back though, a simple chicken and rice from Millie Fenwick, because Millie had made it exactly the way Frank used to like it, and something about that felt less like a gift and more like a message passed between two widows who understood each other without needing to say so. Roger and Deborah came by twice in those 9 days, both times briefly, both times with an undercurrent Eleanor recognised even through her grief, the particular restlessness of people already thinking 2 steps past the funeral toward whatever came next. Curtis came by every single evening, sometimes just to sit with her in the kitchen without saying much, and once on the 7th night to help her go through Walter's closet, folding his shirts into boxes for donation, with a gentleness that surprised her given how little practice her younger son had ever had folding anything. "You don't have to do this yet," Curtis said, holding one of his father's flannel shirts a beat too long before setting it in the box. "There's no rush, Mom. There's always a little rush," Eleanor said, "just not the kind that shows." She thought more than once in those 9 days about the exact sentence Walter used to say at the register, about counting the nails twice. And she thought it was strange, the way a marriage leaves you with a handful of ordinary phrases that outlive the person who said them, phrases that mean nothing to anyone else and everything to you, small coded messages you carry the rest of your life without ever needing them translated. The will reading happened 9 days after the funeral. 2nd floor of Corbett and Lane, above the old Millhaven Trust Building, on Main. A room that smelled like paper and the dust that settles where families go to hear what they've been left. Grant Corbett had been Walter's lawyer for 11 years, 61, grey at the temples. Careful the way a man gets after drafting 1,000 wills and watching 1,000 families find out exactly who they are in the 90 seconds after. He sat behind a desk that had been his father's desk. Across from him sat Eleanor, Roger, Deborah, Curtis, and Curtis's fiancée Anna, who'd come mostly because Curtis asked her to, and mostly said nothing the whole meeting. The house at 14 Cutters Ridge Road, Corbett read, passes to Eleanor Voss, along with the checking and savings accounts. And the vehicle. He looked up. The store, Voss Hardware, the will directs be sold. Proceeds split between Roger and Curtis. Roger exhaled, like a man setting down something heavy. "Good," he said, before he could stop himself, then had the decency to look briefly embarrassed. "I mean, good, that's straightforward. We can list it fast. The county's assessed the house at $214,000, Corbett added, glancing at a separate sheet. Checking and savings together come to just under $31,000. The vehicle's a wash, 6 years old, maybe $4,000 at trade-in. That's the general estate as filed." He set the sheet down. There's also a specific bequest, a green filing box, currently in the store's back office, labelled Inventory, 1994. Walter left instruction it passes to Eleanor specifically, separate from the general estate. Deborah laughed. A short, surprised sound she tried to cover with her hand. "An inventory box," she said. "Sorry. That's very Walter." She looked at Eleanor, and it might have been meant kindly. It didn't land that way. "At least you get something that's just yours, Eleanor." Roger nodded along. Already thinking about the store listing. Already running numbers, the way Eleanor could tell a boy was lying about his homework. Nobody at that table asked to open the green box. Nobody thought there was a reason to. Eleanor took it home that same afternoon. Battered box, the size of 2 shoeboxes stacked. The cardboard soft at the corners from 30 years, in a back office that flooded twice. She set it on the kitchen table, the table where she and Walter had eaten 10,000 dinners. She didn't open it that day. She was too tired. Grief, she was learning, isn't a feeling so much as a kind of gravity. Some days it just pins you to a chair. Roger moved first, 7 days after the reading, drove up to the Ridge House Saturday morning with a folder of his own, sat at that same kitchen table, told his mother, gently, in the voice he used on clients he was about to disappoint, that he and Deborah had been thinking. The house was a lot for one person. Maybe it made more sense financially for everyone if she moved in with them a while, just to help out, just while things settled. You'd have the guest room, Roger said. It's a nice room, Mum. And it'd be good. Company. Eleanor asked him, evenly, what would happen to the house. We'd list it, Roger said. Eventually. It doesn't make sense empty. No rush, though. He said no rush the way people say it right before there's an enormous rush. Eleanor, who'd balanced hardware store books in her head for 3 decades before Walter ever bought a computer he never learned to use, heard the rush anyway. Underneath the sentence, the way you hear a leak in a pipe before you see the water. She agreed to move in, not because she believed there was no rush. A woman alone in a 4-bedroom house on a fixed income does the math too. And Curtis, calling that same night, told her quietly that Roger had remortgaged his own house that spring. Some investment that hadn't worked out. A vending machine route. 40 machines across 3 counties. Bleeding money instead of making it. Deborah had already told her sister the down payment on a lake condo was as good as done. Eleanor packed one suitcase and the green filing box and moved into the guest room the second Tuesday in April. She left the Ridge house locked, but not exactly empty of her, the way a house never quite empties of the person who kept it 39 years. She didn't know yet that in 19 days she'd stand in that guest room's doorway with the same suitcase, told to wait until Friday. She didn't know the green box had a false bottom, or that her husband, closing a register some ordinary Friday 4 years before he died, had done something in this town's courthouse neither son had thought to check. She knew only that the register was only ever wrong once, and that Walter had never once, in 31 years, been wrong about which drawer to trust. The 19 days in between were quiet in a way Eleanor came to recognise as its own kind of message. Nobody was cruel to her, exactly. Deborah asked most mornings how she'd slept. Bright, specific, like a hostess counting the days until her guest leaves. Roger came home late most nights, talked to his phone at dinner more than to anyone at the table, scrolling something with his thumb while his mother passed the peas. The same way he used to scroll homework answers under the table at 12, thinking she couldn't see. She kept busy. She'd never sat still well. Helped with the dishes even when Deborah told her not to. Folded the laundry into corners so sharp, Deborah eventually stopped folding it herself. Evenings, she sat with the green filing box on the dresser and didn't open it. There's a difference between a tired woman and a ready one. She was still tired. Roger changed the locks on the store himself, called it insurance. Drove to Front Street on a Wednesday with a locksmith named P.T. Ackers, 2 years behind Roger in school, who mostly remembered him for cheating off a chemistry test. Roger told P.T. the old locks hadn't been changed in a decade. Said an empty commercial building can't be too careful. Both true. Neither the real reason. The real reason came out later. Not from Roger. From Curtis, calling his mother a Thursday night. Voice low, the way it got when he didn't want Anna hearing him worry out loud in the next room. He's already got a listing agent, Curtis said, for the store. Guy named Pruitt, commercial stuff on Route 9. Roger had him out there Tuesday before the locks even got changed, walking the floor with a tape measure. That's fast, Eleanor said. Yeah. A pause. Mom, I think he needs it fast. The vending thing. I heard him on the phone with Deborah's brother, the one who does loans. He's underwater on both mortgages. I don't think Deborah even knows how bad. Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment. She was standing in Roger and Deborah's kitchen, phone against her ear, looking out at a backyard that wasn't hers, at a swing set his kids had outgrown 5 years back that nobody had taken down. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. I just don't want you blindsided, Curtis said, that's all. She was blindsided anyway, 9 days later, in the guest room doorway holding the suitcase. Deborah's talk of clutter on Friday was, Eleanor understood even as it happened, the sound of a house getting cleared for listing photos. Not a room being tidied for a mother-in-law. She'd seen the pattern before. 31 years watching families come through the cafeteria line. The ones who suddenly needed the extra folding table gone, the extra chair, the extra person. She went to Millie Fenwick's. Millie lived 2 streets over, in a bungalow that had belonged to her late husband Frank. He'd run the plumbing side of Voss Hardware for 22 years before his own heart gave out, 4 years ahead of Walter's. Frank and Walter had been partners in everything but the deed, closed the store together most nights, split a thermos of coffee on cold mornings before customers came in. Millie was 70, sharp-eyed, and she opened her door before Eleanor even knocked. She watched the whole 19 days from 2 streets away, the way small towns watch everything. "I've got the porch daybed made up," Millie said, taking the suitcase before Eleanor could protest. "And don't you dare tell me Friday's fine. Friday is a stalling tactic, and you know it." Eleanor almost laughed, first real laugh in 19 days. "It's temporary," she said. "Everything's temporary, Ellie. Come inside before you catch cold being proud on my porch." The green filing box came too, wedged under one arm, the way you'd carry something you didn't quite trust to the trunk. It sat 3 more days on the little table by the daybed, next to a lamp shaped like an owl Frank had won at a county fair in 1988. Eleanor slept fitfully under a quilt that smelled like someone else's house, trying to decide what she was going to do with the rest of her life. Those 3 days, Millie fed her without asking whether she was hungry, the way you feed someone you can tell hasn't been eating right on their own. Eggs in the morning, the yolks broken just the way Eleanor liked them, though she never remembered telling Millie that preference and suspected Frank must have mentioned it. Once, decades ago, over some dinner the two couples had shared. Soup at night, always with too much pepper, which Millie apologised for every single time and never once fixed. "You don't have to entertain me," Eleanor said the second evening, watching Millie set down a bowl with the same too heavy hand on the pepper grinder. "I'm not a guest, Millie. I'm a woman sleeping on your porch because my own family couldn't manage a bedroom. You're my oldest friend sleeping somewhere safer than a Sterling House weekly rate," Millie said. "That's a different category entirely. Eat your soup." They talked those evenings about Frank and Walter, more than either of them talked about Roger or Deborah, the 2 men remembered easier than the 2 children currently causing all the trouble. Millie told a story Eleanor hadn't heard before, about Frank and Walter driving 4 hours one January to pick up a shipment of stovepipe that had gotten stranded at a rail depot during a blizzard. The 2 of them convinced, against all sense, that the store couldn't survive a week without it. Coming home half frozen and laughing so hard about the whole trip that neither wife had the heart to be properly angry. "They were fools about that store," Millie said, smiling at the memory. "The good kind of fools, the kind that build something real by being too stubborn to notice how hard it is." It was boredom in the end, more than hope, that made her open it. Millie had gone to her Tuesday bridge game. The house was quiet, that particular quiet of a place you're not used to having all to yourself. Eleanor sat at Millie's kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold, and finally lifted the lid off the box marked Inventory 1994 in Walter's blocky handwriting. Inside were exactly what the label promised. At first, yellowed inventory sheets, columns of pencil figures, the kind of paperwork that once told Walter how many boxes of 10-penny nails sat on a shelf in a given October. Eleanor had kept books like this herself, decades back, before the computer Walter never learned. She flipped through a few sheets out of habit more than curiosity, checking the arithmetic the way you check a hem you've already sewn. The bottom of the box felt wrong under her fingers. Not soft, doubled. She pressed her palm flat and felt it give a half-inch more than cardboard should give. She thought of Walter at the register, 31 years counting the same drawer twice before he'd trust the total. She worked a butter knife under the corner of that false bottom until it lifted. Underneath, flat against the true bottom, was a sealed manila envelope. Her name on it, in Walter's hand. Not Eleanor Voss, just Ellie. She sat very still for a long moment, and the envelope in her lap, unopened. The tea gone fully cold, the owl lamp watching from the little table with its painted glass eyes. She thought about opening it right there alone, the way you open a letter from someone you loved when there's no one else in the room to see your face do whatever it's about to do. She thought about that a long moment. Then she thought about what Walter would have told her to do with anything that mattered. She put the envelope unopened in her handbag. She called Grant Corbett's office the next morning. 31 years of feeding other people's children had taught her one more thing. You take the important paper to somebody with no stake in the answer. You let them read it back to you straight. Corbett's office smelled the way it always had. Paper and old varnish. The dust of a room where families come to hear the truth about themselves. He'd cleared an hour for her, which she noticed because Grant Corbett didn't clear hours for people casually. He sat her down across from his father's old desk and set the manila envelope between them without touching it right away. "You found this in the box," he said. Not quite a question. "Under a false bottom," Eleanor said. "It's got my name on it. Just Ellie." "That's what he called me." Corbett looked at the envelope a moment longer than felt necessary. Eleanor understood, watching him, that some part of him already suspected what was inside, or suspected he ought to know, and couldn't yet place why. He picked up a letter opener shaped like a fish, a gift from some client decades back, and slit the top clean. Inside were two things: a single folded sheet of legal paper and a smaller sealed envelope, thinner, tucked behind it. Corbett unfolded the legal paper first. Eleanor watched his face the way she'd once watched her son's faces across a report card, waiting to hear the number before they said it. "This is a deed," Corbett said slowly, "to 14 Cutters Ridge Road." He looked up. "Eleanor, this is dated 4 years ago. A quitclaim, filed and recorded. Transferring the property into your name alone. Sole owner. Fee simple. It's got a county recording stamp. It's real." Eleanor didn't understand at first, not the words themselves, what they meant for the last 3 weeks of her life. "The house already came to me," she said. "In the will." "It did," Corbett said, "but this predates the will by 4 years. Walter didn't leave you the house in the will, Eleanor. He'd already given it to you. Years ago, before he ever wrote the will your sons read at that table. He set the deed down carefully, the way you set down something that might still detonate if handled wrong. The will's language about the house was almost ceremonial. It was already yours, since before your granddaughter needed an office." "Why?" Eleanor said. It was the only word she had. Corbett turned to the smaller envelope, sealed the same way, and slit it open too. Inside was a single sheet in Walter's handwriting, same blocky hand as the box label. He read it aloud, quietly, the way you read something never meant to be read aloud, but has to be now. "Ellie," it said, "if you're reading this, it's because you finally checked twice. You always do, even when you're tired. I put the house in your name outright the year I refinanced the store. I did not want our boys counting the roof over your mother's head before I'm even cold. I don't say that with any anger at them. Just the plain knowledge of what men do with a number, put in front of them too soon. I kept it quiet. A secret you can't accidentally spill is the only kind worth keeping. There's one more thing you'll need. Grant will know where to find it. The store was never going to be theirs to sell either. Count the nails twice. The register's only ever wrong once. I love you. Walter. Neither spoke for a moment. Below the office on Main Street, a delivery truck downshifted at the light. Eleanor found she was gripping the arms of the chair. Not distress exactly. The particular vertigo of learning the ground you thought had shifted under you had actually never moved at all. It was everyone standing on it who'd been wrong about where it ended. "There's more," Corbett said, and something in his voice had shifted from lawyerly caution into real unease. He said the store was never going to be theirs to sell. "Eleanor, 4 years ago, around the same time as this deed, I notarized something else for Walter. A trust document. I remember the day. I didn't remember, until just now, exactly what it was for. I need to pull the file." He crossed to a bank of grey filing cabinets, the old kind with the sticky middle drawer. Eleanor sat with the deed and the letter in her lap. She thought about her husband, 31 years behind a register, closing out a Friday drawer twice before he'd trust the total. Maybe he'd been doing exactly that with his whole life these last 4 years, without ever mentioning it, checking and rechecking a number he meant to hand her, only when she'd need it counted right. Corbett found the file in 11 minutes, felt longer to Eleanor. He came back with a slim folder, blew a thin layer of dust off the edge, and opened it. The Voss Hardware Trust, he read. Established 4 years ago. Walter transferred the business, the building, the inventory, the accounts receivable, into an irrevocable trust, naming you sole beneficiary. Successor trustee upon his death. He looked up. For the first time in the meeting, something like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. Careful. Professional. Real. "Eleanor, the store isn't part of the estate. It was never Roger and Curtis's to split. Never Roger's to list. It's yours. It's been yours 4 years. Your son currently has a man measuring the floor of a building he doesn't own. Eleanor asked what came next. 31 years managing a lunch line taught her that the moment you learn a fact, you have to decide what to do with it, or it just sits there and rots. Correctly, Corbett said. We confirm it. I don't like surprising a family with a lawyer's letter alone. It tends to make people dig in instead of see straight. I'd like to walk you to the recorder's office myself. Today, if you are able, pull the physical record. Be certain of the date and the stamp before anyone else hears a word. They walked the 2 blocks together, past the diner where Eleanor had eaten 1,000 lunches, past the bank where Walter kept his business accounts 3 decades, into a records room that smelled like every records room Eleanor had ever stood in. Cool, faintly of mildew, lit by fluorescent tubes, buzzing at a pitch only tired ears seemed to notice. The clerk on duty was Arlene Meacham, 60, glasses on a beaded chain, 26 years processing deeds in that office. She greeted Grant Corbett by first name, the way you greet someone you've watched fight quiet, unglamorous battles on behalf of people who couldn't fight for themselves. 14 Cutters Ridge Road, Corbett said, giving her the parcel number. Arlene typed a moment, pulled a thin drawer of microfilm, turned her monitor so Eleanor could see too. Recorded, she read aloud, tapping the screen. 4 years ago this coming October. Grantor, Walter J. Voss. Grantee, Eleanor M. Voss. Sole owner, fee simple. Notarized same day by... She squinted. By you, Grant looks like. I remember now, Corbett said almost to himself. He came in twice that week. I thought it odd at the time. 2 visits so close. I didn't ask. You don't always ask in this job. Sometimes a man just wants his affairs squared before he lets himself stop worrying. There's a current appraisal in the county's own file too, Arlene added, scrolling further. Requested last spring, after the Mills redevelopment announcement went through. 391,000. Land's worth considerably more than it was 4 years ago, with the new access road going in. She glanced at Eleanor over her glasses. Whatever the county assessed at the reading, ma'am, that's not what it's carrying now. Arlene pulled the trust filing next, cross-referenced under the business name. It matched exactly what Corbett's folder said. Voss Hardware. The building. The inventory. The accounts. Sealed into a trust. Eleanor's sole beneficiary. Filed the same week as the deed. 2 documents. 1 intention. 4 years of silence in between. He really did count it twice, Eleanor said, mostly to herself. Arlene glanced up at her with the particular gentleness of a woman who's watched 100 people in that room learn one way or another that someone had loved them more carefully than they'd known. While Eleanor stood in that records room 20 minutes across town, Roger was on the sales floor of his father's store with a man named Dale Pruitt, commercial realtor, fleece vest with his company's logo over the heart, clicking a laser measuring tool the way some men jingle keys. 2,200 square feet on the main floor, Pruitt said, clicking the laser toward the back wall, plus basement storage. Honestly, Roger, this market, buyers are looking at exactly this kind of footprint for a fitness studio. A tap room, front streets coming up. List at 310,000. We could see an offer inside 3 weeks. Let's do 310, Roger said. He'd done the math 6 times already. In the car, at 2 a.m. while Deborah slept. While half the proceeds after the cut, 155,000, split with Curtis, still cleared enough to catch up both mortgages, 22,000 behind on one, just under 9 on the other, and put a real down payment on the lake condo besides. For the first time in 8 months, Roger felt something loosen in his chest. It had been tight since the vending machines started bleeding money the winter before. 40 machines he'd financed with a $51,000 loan against his own house, and not 1 month since had it cleared even half of what he owed on it. I'll have the listing agreement drawn up by Friday, Pruitt said, shaking his hand at the door. Just need your signature. We're moving. Roger drove home feeling, for the first time in a long time, like a man finally ahead of something instead of behind it. He didn't know yet that his mother, that exact hour, was standing in a county records room 2 blocks away, learning that the floor Dale Pruitt had just measured wasn't his, never had been. Deborah spent the day at the kitchen table, laptop open to a listing at Harbourview on Caldwell Lake, Unit 14B, top floor. a balcony facing west for the sunsets. Asking price $242,000, with a suggested down payment of $48,000 that she'd already, in her head, drawn a straight line to from Roger's half of the store sale. She'd called her sister twice about paint colours. In her mind, she'd already arranged the furniture. Anna, Curtis's fiancée, was there that afternoon too, dropping off a casserole dish she'd borrowed weeks earlier, and she stood in the kitchen doorway a moment longer than she needed to, watching Deborah scroll through granite countertop options with the particular focus of a woman building a life on a number that hadn't landed yet. Anna didn't say much most days, a habit Curtis had once explained to Eleanor as simple caution, the kind you learn marrying into a family with more opinions than sense. But she said something to Deborah that afternoon that Eleanor only heard about second-hand, weeks later, from Curtis. "You're picking countertops for a place you don't own yet," Anna had said gently, setting the dish on the counter. "I just think maybe wait till the papers are signed." Deborah had waved it off at the time, called it superstition, said the sale was as good as done. Anna hadn't argued. She'd simply set the dish down, said her goodbyes, and driven home to tell Curtis that evening that something about the whole thing felt unsteady to her, the way a floor feels unsteady before you know exactly which board is loose. It was Pruitt who called first, 3 days later, sounding considerably less pleased than at the handshake. "Roger, we've got a hiccup," Pruitt said. Roger could hear him pacing, the scuff of dress shoes on hardwood. Title company ran the search this morning, ahead of drawing papers. Standard stuff. But they flagged a second deed on the building. And there's a trust document attached to the business. Predates the will. I need you to tell me your lawyer already knows about this, because if you don't have an answer by end of day, I've got to pull the listing before we're both exposed. Roger felt the loosening reverse itself all at once. That cold drop of a number you thought settled, suddenly moving again. "That's got to be a clerical error," he said. Even saying it, he was already thinking of the green filing box, of his mother sitting quiet through the will reading while everyone else talked over her, of the way she'd asked, evenly, who was buying the house, back when he told her not to worry about the paperwork end. Deborah didn't take it well that night. "Just get your mother to sign something," she said, already reaching for her phone, already composing the exact sentence in her head. "There's got to be a form, a release, a waiver, something. She doesn't even want the store, Roger. Never run a business a day in her life. Get her to sign it over so we can close." Roger drove to Millie's the next evening with a single sheet he'd printed off a legal forms website, something titled Quit Claim and Waiver of Interest he didn't fully understand himself. He found his mother on the porch in the last of the evening light, a cup of tea going cold on the little table beside her, the same table, though he didn't know it, where she'd pried up a false bottom 11 days before. "Mum," he said, holding out the paper, "I just need you to sign this. It's a formality. Clears up a title thing." Honestly, nothing. Just gets us all back on track. Eleanor looked at the paper a long moment without taking it. She thought of Walter's letter, still folded in her handbag. Grant will know where to find it, still fresh in her mind, though the paper itself was 4 days old. She thought of her husband counting a drawer twice before he'd trust the total. "I'll want my lawyer to look at it first," she said, the way she'd said 31 years, of gentle, immovable no's to 1,100 children a day, wanting a second dessert. "You understand?" Roger stood on the porch a moment, paper still in hand. Something shifted in his face. Some old childhood instinct, recognizing a door, had just very quietly closed. "Whose lawyer?" he said slowly. "What do you mean, your lawyer?" "Grant Corbett," Eleanor said. "He's been ours 11 years, Roger. He's still mine." She picked her tea back up, though it had gone cold. "There's comfort in the shape of a cup in your hands, even when the tea has nothing left to give. I think you and Deborah should come by his office. There's things your father set up you're going to want explained properly. I'd rather Grant explain them than me." Roger left the porch without the signed paper, without, Eleanor could tell, any real understanding of what was coming. She watched his taillights turn off Millie's street, disappear toward the house that was, technically, still hers. She sat a long while in the dark after that, tea gone entirely cold, thinking about her husband. She hadn't told Curtis yet. Deliberate. Curtis had been kind through all of it. The quiet phone calls, the warning about the vending machines, 4 seconds of an arm around her shoulders at the funeral she'd let herself lean into. She didn't want to put him in the position of knowing something his brother didn't. She called him the next morning instead, told him plainly, the way you tell a child the truth about a broken window rather than let him keep guessing. "There's a second deed," she said. "Your father put the house in my name outright. 4 years before he died. The will didn't really give it to me, Curtis. It was already mine. And the store went into a trust the same week. Mine too. Never part of what you and Roger were supposed to split." The line went quiet a moment. "Okay," Curtis said finally, slowly, working through it the way he worked through everything. Methodical. No drama. "So what happens to the money? Roger's already... he's got a listing agreement basically ready to sign on the store." "That just falls apart?" "It falls apart," Eleanor said. "It was never his to list." Another pause. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not disappointed," Curtis said. "I was counting on the split too, Mum. I won't lie about that. But I'm not going to tell you Dad did something wrong making sure you had a floor to stand on. He watched you get handed a filing box, like a joke at that reading. I watched it too. Should have said something then and didn't. You don't have to apologise for staying quiet at a table where your brother was doing all the talking." Eleanor said, "I've done 30 years of that myself." "Will you tell me when the meeting's set?" Curtis said. "The one with Corbett. I want to be there. Not for me. For you." She told him it'd likely be the following week, once Corbett finished confirming everything with the county. Drafted a clean summary to hand across a table. A lawyer, she was learning, doesn't like walking into a room with a truth this large without every corner squared first. The same way Deborah had once squared a folder's edges, for entirely the wrong reasons. The week after was the strangest of Eleanor's life since the funeral. A week waiting inside, a fact she already knew but couldn't yet use. She stayed at Millie's, sleeping better than she had in 19 days. Millie, who'd guessed most of it from the shape of Eleanor's face, made her tea every morning and didn't ask more than Eleanor offered. "You could gloat, you know," Millie said one evening, drying dishes at the sink while Eleanor put away the good silverware Millie insisted on using, even weeknights. Frank always said the quietest people in a room are usually holding the biggest hand. He'd have loved this. "I'm not interested in gloating," Eleanor said. "I just want my house back. My store open again. Roger and Deborah can be as embarrassed as they need on their own time." "That's very gracious of you," Millie said, "for a woman who spent 19 days sleeping on my porch because her daughter-in-law couldn't be bothered to move a box of old files off her bed." Eleanor smiled. First easy smile Millie had seen on her in months. "I didn't say I wasn't going to enjoy the meeting," she said. "Just said I wasn't going to gloat during it." Across town, Dale Pruitt formally pulled the store listing, sent Roger a curt 3-line email, used the phrase "clouded title" twice, closed with a note that his firm would gladly revisit, once ownership was, in his words, resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Roger read it in his own driveway, felt, second time in a week, the particular vertigo of a number moving after he'd already spent it in his head. His own bank called 2 days after. Not about the store, about the second mortgage he'd taken against his own house the spring before. $51,000, meant to prop up the vending machine route until it turned a corner it was never going to turn. The loan officer, a polite young man named Griggs, explained that a periodic review had flagged the file, given some changes in Roger's reported assets. A careful way of saying that somewhere in his loan application, 8 months back, Roger had listed an expected inheritance, $155,000 of it, as collateral against that same $51,000. The bank, doing its own quiet arithmetic, wanted to know now exactly what that inheritance actually was. Roger didn't have a good answer. He hadn't had one, honestly, since Pruitt's email landed. He told Griggs he'd need a few weeks to sort out some estate matters. Griggs, mild and patient, the voice of a man who'd heard that sentence from 100 people in 100 kinds of trouble, said the bank could give him 30 days before the file moved to a different kind of review. Deborah, listening to half the call, didn't need the other half explained. Harbourview Unit 14B, top floor, was moving further away with every phone call, not closer. "What did your mother do?" she said once Roger hung up. An edge in it now, not there on the porch that first evening, back when clutter had seemed a reasonable word for another person's whole life packed into a suitcase. "She didn't do anything," Roger said, and heard, even saying it, that it was true in a way that made it worse. Dad did it. 4 years ago, she just found it. Eleanor herself went back to the store alone, the day after the courthouse trip, before anyone else knew what she'd found. Not to work, just to stand there. She used her old key, the one she'd carried on her own ring for 31 years, and it still turned, even with Roger's new locks bolted over the old ones on the front door, because Petey Ackers, it turned out, had left the back entrance untouched. Nobody had thought to change a door nobody used. The store smelled the way it always had, sawdust and gun oil, and the particular metal smell of nails in bulk bins. Dust had settled on everything, in the weeks it sat closed. A thin grey film over the counter, where Walter used to stand, over the register he'd been ringing when his heart stopped. Eleanor ran her hand along that counter. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying months ago, in private, in ways nobody in her family had ever seen and never would. She just stood there a while, hand flat on the wood, the way you'd rest a hand on someone's shoulder. You really did think of everything, she said out loud, to the empty store, to nobody. Even this. Even now. She walked the aisles slowly, touched the bins of screws, the rack of work gloves, the paint mixer in the back that hadn't run in months. Everything exactly where he'd left it. A business frozen mid-breath, waiting for someone to walk back in and pick up where it stopped. She found in the back office the ledger drawer already unlocked, the one she'd opened with Walter's keyring the week before. She sat again on the same overturned bucket and read through his private accounting one more time, slower this time, not rushing toward the last entry. Reading instead the ordinary ones, small deposits, a payment toward the roof in year 11, a note about a slow winter in year 19, when he'd almost had to lay off the one part-time clerk he kept. Every entry, she realised, reading them in order for the first time, was really the same sentence, said 1,000 different ways across 3 decades. I am trying to build something that lasts longer than I will. She locked the back door behind her when she left, the same untouched door Roger's locksmith had missed, and drove back to Millie's with the ledger on the passenger seat beside her, buckled in like a person, because it felt, that evening, like the closest thing to company Walter had left her. Before any of that landed for real, there was a Sunday dinner that almost undid the whole quiet plan. Eleanor thought about it often after, the way you think about a near miss on an icy road. Deborah called 4 days after the porch visit, voice bright, careful, the way a woman sounds trying to seem like nothing's changed. We're doing Sunday dinner, Deborah said. Roger's idea, actually. Thought it'd be nice, everyone together before things get complicated with lawyers and paperwork. Just family. No agenda. Eleanor understood there was an agenda. The way she'd known a boy was going to ask for extra dessert 3 tables down the cafeteria line before he'd opened his mouth. She came anyway. Refusing would have told them she was afraid of the room, and she wasn't. She dressed carefully. Not vanity. Steadiness. The navy dress pressed the night before. Walter's reading glasses folded once more into her coat pocket, though she had no need of them. Carrying them had become its own kind of ballast. She brought a pie. Apple. The kind she'd made every autumn for 39 years. A woman doesn't stop being the person who brings a pie just because the people at the table stop deserving one. Dinner started ordinary. Roger carved a chicken, clearly bought pre-roasted, dressed up with his own seasoning. Eleanor noticed, said nothing. The grandchildren, Brittany included, talked over each other about school, the easy, oblivious way children do at a table, where the adults are performing normal for their benefit. It was only after the plates cleared that Deborah brought out a second folder, thinner than Roger's from the reading, set it beside Eleanor's water glass, light as anything, though the weight inside it didn't match. We talked to an estate mediator, Deborah said. Totally informal. No lawyers yet. Just someone who helps families work things out amicably before it gets expensive and ugly. She suggested a path where everyone comes out ahead. You get a life estate in the house, Eleanor, meaning you live there as long as you like, completely secure. In exchange, the store gets listed now instead of waiting on whatever your lawyer thinks he's found. Everyone gets something. Nobody has to feel like they lost. Eleanor set down her fork. 31 years had taught her exactly how long to let a silence sit at a table before a child fills it with the truth. She used every second, watching Deborah's bright face lose some of its brightness. I appreciate you thinking of a path, Eleanor said finally, but I already have the house, Deborah. Outright. It isn't something that needs mediating into a life estate. A life estate's a smaller thing than what I already hold. I don't intend to trade down. Roger's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "You don't know that for certain," he said, though something in his voice was already conceding it. Corbett hasn't finished confirming anything. "You said yourself it's not settled." "It's recorded at the county, Roger," Eleanor said. "Settled 4 years ago. I only just found out about it. Different things." She picked her fork back up, calm, unhurried, cut a bite of pie she'd made with her own hands, in a kitchen that was, in fact, already hers. "I understand why a path where everyone comes out ahead sounds nice tonight. I'd like that too, honestly. I'm not going to pretend a thing's uncertain just because it'd be more comfortable for the rest of you." Brittany, 16, sharper than either parent seemed to remember, looked up from her phone for the first time all evening. "Wait," she said. "Is this about the house? Mom, is Grandma losing the house?" "No, sweetheart," Deborah said too quickly. "Just grown-up paperwork?" "Sounds like Grandma's not losing the house," Brittany said, with the flat clarity of a teenager who's just done the arithmetic. Her parents were hoping to keep hidden a while longer. "Sounds like you guys thought you were getting it, and now you're not." Nobody corrected her. Eleanor thought later that was its own kind of confirmation. Roger cleared his throat, changed the subject to a football game nobody had been watching. Dinner limped to a close in a silence that had nothing companionable left in it. Eleanor drove back to Millie's that night thinking a mediator's folder, however lightly set beside her water glass, had told her something the porch visit hadn't. Faced with a closing door, Deborah would keep reaching for a different handle rather than accept the room was occupied. The following week, a second, smaller thread surfaced. One Eleanor hadn't expected. Corbett called her directly, a note of real surprise in his voice she hadn't heard from him before in 11 years. "There's a locked drawer in the store's back office," Corbett said. "Bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, across from where the green box sat." Roger mentioned it to Pruitt during the walkthrough, said it had always been locked. Walter never explained why. Pruitt mentioned it to me when he called to withdraw the listing. "Eleanor, do you still have a key to that cabinet?" She didn't remember the drawer being locked. She remembered the cabinet, though. Battered grey, 4 drawers, in that back office since before either son was born. She drove to the store that afternoon with Walter's keyring. 40 years of accumulated brass and steel she'd never bothered to sort. Tried 9 keys before the 10th turned, stiff, in a lock that hadn't opened in years. Inside wasn't another sealed envelope with her name on it. Simpler than that. More moving. A shoebox of photographs she'd never seen. Walter Young, before she knew him. Working construction 2 summers before he'd saved enough, $1,100, to buy into the store with a partner who later sold him out entirely. Beneath the photographs, a single ledger book, spine cracked from handling. Recording, in Walter's earliest, less practiced hand, every dollar he'd ever put toward the store across 3 decades. The first entry, dated the year they married, read $400, all he had, against Frank's father's original asking price of $6,000 for the building outright. A private accounting, kept for himself alone, not the business's profit, the personal cost of building something that would outlast him. The last entry, dated the same week as the deed and the trust, 4 years before he died, read simply, "Paid in full, 4 years early, and it's hers now, every board of it." Eleanor sat on an overturned bucket in that back office a long while, the ledger open on her knees. Her husband had kept 2 sets of books, she thought, the ordinary kind telling him how many nails sat on the shelf, and the private kind telling him, 1 entry at a time, exactly how much of himself he'd spent making sure she'd never again stand in a doorway asking where she should go. She brought the ledger to Corbett the next morning, not because it changed anything legally, the trust and deed already stood on their own. She wanted a witness to a private grief she wasn't ready to carry alone. Corbett read the last entry twice, set the ledger down carefully, said, voice losing some of its lawyerly distance, that in 11 years drawing up wills for half of Millhaven, he'd rarely seen a man plan this thoroughly, for a wife he clearly assumed, correctly as it turned out, would outlive him. Corbett told her that same morning he wanted a little more time before calling everyone together. Not doubt in the documents themselves. He'd learned across 3 decades that whether a family recovers from a hard truth or shatters over it often comes down to how carefully the ground gets prepared first. He wanted to speak with the title insurer on the Ridge House, confirm no liens Walter might have layered on after that Eleanor didn't know about. And he admitted he wanted a few days just to think about how to say it all, in a room that would hold more feeling than most rooms he sat people down in. Those extra days stretched to nearly 3 weeks. Eleanor spent them the way she'd spent most of her adult life, working. Curtis had by then all but moved his evenings into the store, learning the supplier accounts, which regulars needed credit extended to the 15th, which paid cash and complained about it. Learning, in short, the 1,000 small mercies his father had built into a business that looked, from outside, like nothing but nails and paint and hardware. Dad used to let old Mr. Pruitt run a tab through the winter, Curtis told her one evening, going through a ledger of accounts receivable older than the private one. I always thought he forgot to collect. It's not that. Look, right here. $91 carried from November clean through April, 3 years running. Pruitt's on a fixed income. Let it ride till spring. Don't mention it to him. Your father remembered everyone's spring, Eleanor said. The one thing he was better at than me. I remembered who needed extra pudding. He remembered who needed the winter. Anna came by the store that same week, unannounced. A paper bag of sandwiches from the diner balanced on one arm, the kind of small errand she'd started running without being asked, once Curtis began spending his evenings restocking shelves instead of sitting across from her at dinner. She found Eleanor in the back office, going through a stack of supplier invoices, and stood a moment in the doorway before speaking, the same habit Eleanor had noticed in her at Deborah's kitchen table weeks before. I never told Deborah I said anything, Anna said, setting the bag on the desk, about the countertops. I felt strange about it after, like I was tempting something I had no right to know about. You weren't wrong to say it, Eleanor told her. A floor feels unsteady before anyone can name the board. You named it plainer than most people would have. Married into this family only 3 years. I like Curtis's family, Anna said, careful with the words. I didn't like watching what almost happened to you in it. She hesitated, then added, he talks about you differently now, since the reading. Like he's decided something about what kind of man he's going to be, watching how it landed on you. Eleanor didn't answer that right away. She thought of the 4 seconds at the funeral, the arm around her shoulders, the whole quiet accounting Curtis had been running on himself since. He decided that a long time before the reading, she said finally. The reading just gave him somewhere to put it. It was Millie, of all people, who forced Corbett's hand on scheduling. Millie played Bridge Tuesdays with a rotating table of Millhaven women that had, over 4 decades, become something like an unofficial intelligence service for the whole town. One Tuesday she came home flushed, the particular energy of a woman who's learned something and is failing to hide how badly she wants to share it. Deborah's sister was at the beauty parlour, Millie announced, setting her purse down harder than necessary, telling anyone who'd sit still that Roger and Deborah are talking to a different lawyer. Not Corbett. Someone from Erie, apparently. Specialises in contesting trusts. Something tightened in Eleanor's chest that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a tiredness she hadn't expected, so soon after Millie's porch had started to feel like solid ground. Contesting how? She said. It's recorded. Arlene pulled the file herself. I don't know the how, Millie said, softer now, sitting across from her. I know the who. Ellie, call Grant before they get further down that road. A family that hires an outside lawyer to fight a recorded deed isn't looking for the truth anymore. They're looking for a way to make the truth cost more than it's worth to defend. Eleanor called Corbett that evening. He didn't sound surprised so much as resigned. The particular weariness of a man who's watched grief curdle into litigation more times than he could count. He explained patiently that a properly recorded, notarized deed, executed while a grantor was of sound mind, is exceedingly hard to overturn. That Walter's own doctor's records from that period, which Corbett could subpoena, if it came to that, would show no cognitive concerns whatsoever 4 years before his death. That an out-of-town lawyer taking a contingency case on a matter this settled was, in his professional opinion, more likely angling for a quick nuisance settlement than a courtroom win. But I'd rather not let it get that far, Corbett said. I think we call the meeting now. All of us. Before anyone spends another $1 on a lawyer telling them what they want to hear instead of what's true. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a family about to make an expensive mistake is not give them the extra week to make it in. It was Curtis in the end who confronted his brother about the Erie lawyer. Not anger, exactly. The particular fatigue of a younger sibling who spent his whole life watching an older one reach for the version of events that costs him the least. He drove to Roger's a Wednesday evening, unannounced, found Roger in the garage, of all places, sitting in the older paid-for car he'd replaced the lease with, not going anywhere. just sitting. "You're really doing this," Curtis said, standing in the doorway, "hiring someone to fight Mom over a deed that's already recorded." Roger didn't look up right away. "It's not about fighting her," he said. Even he seemed to hear how thin it sounded. "It's about understanding our options. That's all a consultation is, Curtis. Options. Dad's own doctor's going to testify he was sharp as a tack," Curtis said. "You know that. Everybody in this town knows that. He was running that register the morning he died, doing math in his head faster than the machine. What exactly do you think this lawyer's going to find that Grant Corbett and the county recorder both missed?" Roger sat quiet a long moment, hands still on a wheel, going nowhere. "I think," he said finally, "I've spent 8 months underwater on 2 mortgages, and a business I was too proud to admit was failing. Somewhere in there, I convinced myself the estate was going to fix it. Turns out it was never going to, because Dad already knew I'd try to use it that way. He built a wall around Mom specifically so I couldn't." He looked up at Curtis. "I don't actually think the lawyer's going to find anything. I think I just wanted one more week where it wasn't real yet." Curtis didn't have an easy answer for that. It was, he had to admit, a more honest sentence than he'd expected from his brother in a garage on a Wednesday night. "Call off the Erie guy," Curtis said. "Whatever this costs you, Roger. Fighting it costs more. Not just money. Mom's not going to forgive a lawsuit the way she might forgive an apology." Roger cancelled the consultation the next morning, before it was even formally scheduled. Eleanor heard about it not from Roger, who still wasn't calling her directly, but from Curtis, then a day later from Millie's bridge table, which had tracked the family's entire unravelling with more precision than any lawyer involved. Even so, Corbett wanted more than a cancelled phone call before he'd feel easy calling the whole family together. He asked Eleanor to come by his office once more, the Monday before the meeting, and this time he wasn't alone. A second man sat in the client chair beside the desk when Patricia showed her in. Grey suit, a leather portfolio balanced on one knee, the particular stillness of a man used to being the most careful person in any room he entered. "This is Warren Cassidy," Corbett said. "Title examiner, works out of Pittsburgh. I brought him in privately, on my own dime, the day after you found the envelope. Wanted a second set of eyes on both filings before I'd stand in front of your family and call this settled. Didn't want to be wrong about something this size." Cassidy opened the portfolio and laid 2 documents on the desk, copies Eleanor recognised from the courthouse, though he'd marked them with small coloured tabs she hadn't seen before. "I've examined probably 4,000 deeds in 20 years, he said, "and I want to be playing with you, Mrs. Voss, because Grant asked me to be. This one's clean. Properly witnessed, properly notarized, properly recorded the same week it was executed. No gap, no backdating, nothing a contesting lawyer could hang a real argument on. I'd stake my license on it." He tapped the trust folder next. "This one's cleaner, if anything. Irrevocable trust this well-drafted usually cost 4 times what your husband paid Grant for it." "What did he pay?" Eleanor asked, because it was, suddenly, the only question that felt safe to ask out loud. $600 for the deed work, Corbett said. $1,200 for the trust, all in, filing fees included. I remember because he paid cash, out of an envelope, and joked that a hardware man doesn't believe in invoices he can't hold in his hand. He almost smiled at the memory. $1,800, Eleanor, to protect something now worth the better part of $600,000 between the house and the store combined. I've drafted estates for men worth $10 million who didn't spend that carefully. Eleanor sat with that a moment. $1,800, less than 1 month's grocery bill for a family the size hers used to be, spent so quietly across 2 ordinary Tuesdays that not even his own lawyer had connected the 2 visits until 3 weeks ago. She thought of every dollar she'd ever watched Walter count twice at that register, the $4.11 for a box of nails, and understood, for the first time fully, that the habit had never been about nails at all. I wanted you walking into Thursday knowing it wasn't just Grant's word, Cassidy said, closing the portfolio. A family that's about to hear something this large deserves to know. 2 separate professionals looked at it hard, from 2 separate offices, and came back with the same answer. That's not comfort. That's just fact, laid out plain. Eleanor thanked him, and meant it, and drove back to Millie's that evening with one more piece of certainty folded into the ones she already carried. Millie, reading her face at the door, the way she'd read it every evening for 3 weeks now, didn't ask what happened. Just put the kettle on and let Eleanor tell it when she was ready. which took until the tea had gone halfway to lukewarm, the way most of Eleanor's hardest sentences did lately. Grant Corbett's office called the following Monday, set the meeting for Thursday at 4. Eleanor asked that Curtis be included. Corbett, who by then had spent the better part of a week confirming every piece with the county, the trust bank custodian, and his own file cabinet, said that was not only fine but wise. A family meeting with only some of the family present tends to breed the kind of resentment that later needs a second lawyer to untangle. The 3 days between the call and the meeting passed slower for Eleanor than almost any stretch since the funeral. She kept the store open, out of habit, and the plain need to sell nails to whoever walked in. She found herself watching the clock above the register more than the register itself, counting hours the way she once counted a lunch line, waiting for the number to hit the point where the whole day could finally exhale. Millie insisted on driving her, though she stayed in the car, parked on Main with a paperback and a thermos of coffee. Because, as she put it, some rooms a friend waits outside of. Not because she doesn't care what happens inside, because it isn't her name on the deed. Eleanor appreciated the distinction more than she said out loud. She wore the navy dress again, not from lack of other clothes. She'd come to think of it quietly as the dress she wore into rooms where her family needed to hear something true. Comfort in the repetition, the way there's comfort in an old recipe, a familiar hymn. Walter's reading glasses went into her coat pocket one more time. By now she barely noticed doing it. Her thumb found the scratched lens before she'd even reached the office door. Corbett met her in the small waiting area, before Roger and Deborah arrived. For a moment it was just the two of them. He said something that surprised her, coming from a man who'd been carefully professional their whole acquaintance. "I want you to know," he said, "in 11 years drawing up papers for your husband, I never once saw him do anything by half measures. Whatever happens in that room today, the paper is solid. I wouldn't be walking you into it otherwise." He hesitated, then added, quieter, "Walter used to say you were the only person in Mill Haven who could catch a mistake in a column of numbers faster than he could make one. I think he built all of this counting on that being just as true the day he wasn't here to help you find it." Eleanor had to look away a moment. Out the window at Main Street below, at Millie's car parked with its hazards blinking, before she trusted her voice again. "He was a good counter of his own mistakes too," she said finally. "That's rarer than people think." Roger and Deborah arrived at 3:58, 2 minutes early, dressed the way people dress for a meeting. They've decided, in advance, is a formality that'll go their way. Deborah brought a folder, out of habit more than need, its edges squared the way a woman squares a folder when presentation is the last lever left to pull. Eleanor watched her set it on the desk and thought Deborah still didn't understand there was nothing left in the room for a folder to accomplish. Roger wore the same grey suit from the will reading. Eleanor noticed it fit him looser now than 8 weeks back. The particular thinness of a man who stopped eating properly out of worry. Patricia, Corbett's secretary, 19 years in that office, offered coffee. Deborah accepted a cup she never drank, holding it for something to do with her hands. Roger declined, sat with his hands flat on his knees, a posture Eleanor recognised from his childhood. The exact way he used to sit in the principal's office at Mill Haven Elementary, waiting to hear how much trouble he was in, back when Eleanor was sometimes the one called down from the cafeteria to sit beside him. "I want to say something before we start," Roger said, before Corbett had even settled into his chair. It cost him something to get the sentence out ahead of the official business. "Whatever's in that envelope, I'm not here to fight it. Deborah and I talked last night. If Dad did something with the house and the store, that's his right. I'm not going to sit here pretending I've got some claim on my mother's own home." Deborah's face flickered, brief, unguarded. Surprise, mixed with something like resigned agreement, as though this were a concession she'd argued against the night before and lost. "We just want to understand it," she added more carefully. "That's all. Understand what happened and why nobody told us." Curtis arrived at 4. Exactly. Alone. Anna had offered to come, and Curtis had gently told her this one was family only. He sat beside his mother, not across from her, which Eleanor noticed and didn't comment on. He gave his brother a small nod on his way to the chair. Not quite forgiveness, not quite anything yet. An acknowledgement they were, for the moment, on the same side of the desk instead of opposite ones. Grant Corbett waited until Patricia closed the office door behind her. The small, ceremonial pause he always allowed a room. The one Eleanor imagined he'd used 1,000 times across 11 years. letting the last of the small talk settle before the real weight of a meeting came down, because he'd learned long ago that people hear hard news better sitting down, and worse standing up halfway to the door. "I asked you all here," Corbett said, "because there's information that came to light after the will reading that materially changes the picture. I think it's important everyone hear it together. From me, rather than in pieces from each other." He paused there, longer than a lawyer usually pauses. Eleanor understood he was giving the room one more moment of the ordinary before the extraordinary arrived. The same courtesy a doctor extends before reading a chart out loud. Roger's hands were still flat on his knees. Deborah's coffee had gone cold, untouched. "Before I open this," Corbett said, "I want to be clear about something, because it matters how this lands. Nobody deceived anyone in this room on purpose, except in the sense that Walter deceived all of you, deliberately, for reasons he explained in his own hand. We'll get to that. I didn't know about any of this until 3 weeks ago, when Eleanor brought me an envelope she found hidden inside a box the will specifically directed to her. I want that on the record too. This isn't a lawyer's trick. It isn't a mother's maneuver. It's a dead man's plan, executed exactly as he intended, coming to light exactly when he intended it to." He set the manila envelope on the desk, top already slit clean from the first reading, and beside it, the deed and the trust folder from the county, squared with the same careful precision Deborah usually reserved for her own folders, though nobody but Eleanor seemed to notice the small, unspoken symmetry of it. 4 years ago, Corbett said, Walter came to my office twice in 1 week. The first visit, he executed a quitclaim deed transferring 14 cutters, Ridge Road, into Eleanor's name alone. Sole owner, fee simple. That deed was recorded at the county the same week. He turned it so Roger and Deborah could see the recording stamp themselves, the date embossed clean and official at the bottom corner. The second visit, he established an irrevocable trust holding Voss Hardware, the building on Front Street, its inventory, its accounts receivable, naming Eleanor sole beneficiary and successor trustee. Roger leaned forward and read the stamp himself, lips moving slightly, the way they had as a boy, sounding out a word too big for him. Eleanor watched something drain slowly out of his face. Not shock exactly. The particular greyness of a man watching a number he'd already spent reverse itself in real time. "This is dated before the will," Roger said. 4 years before, Corbett said. The will's language directing the house to Eleanor was, legally, somewhat ceremonial. She already owned it outright. And the store was never part of the estate at all. It couldn't be split between you and Curtis because your father had already removed it from his own ownership years before he died. "That's not," Deborah started. Stopped. Started again. Voice pitched higher than the room. "That's not possible. We had a listing agreement. We had a buyer's agent walking the floor. There has to be some kind of mistake in the filing. Some clerical thing." "I sat in the county recorder's office myself," Corbett said, gently but without give, "with Eleanor and with Arlene Meacham, who's processed deeds in that building 26 years. There's no clerical error. The deed is properly executed, notarized, recorded. The trust is the same. I'm sorry to be the one telling you this in a room rather than letting it sit easier over time. There isn't a way to make this smaller than it is." Roger sat very still a moment, hands flat on his knees. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the practiced ease Eleanor remembered from 100 sales calls overheard through a closed office door. "Why would he do this?" Roger said, "and not tell any of us?" "Not tell me." Eleanor answered before Corbett could. "He told me why," she said. She took the folded letter from her handbag, creases already soft from handling. He wrote it down. "Do you want to hear it? Or would you rather I just tell you what it says?" Roger didn't answer right away. Curtis beside her said quietly, "Read it, Mum." Eleanor unfolded the letter. Read it in the same voice she'd used 31 years to explain to a crying 7-year-old why there wasn't a second helping of pudding. Patient. Clear. No cruelty in it, but no softening either. "Ellie," she read, "if you're reading this, it's because you finally checked twice. You always do eventually, even when you're tired. I put the house in your name outright the year I refinanced the store. I did not want our boys counting the roof over your mother's head before I'm even cold. I don't say that with any anger at them. Only the plain knowledge of what men do with a number put in front of them too soon." She looked up once, briefly, at Roger, Back down at the page. I kept it quiet. A secret you can't accidentally spill is the only kind worth keeping. There is one more thing you'll need, and Grant will know where to find it. The store was never going to be theirs to sell either. Count the nails twice. The register's only ever wrong once. I love you. Walter. The room stayed quiet long enough Eleanor could hear the radiator against the far wall tick once, twice. The sound it made when the building's old heat kicked on. Deborah had stopped reaching for her folder. Roger had his eyes fixed somewhere past the edge of the desk, the middle distance a man goes to when doing arithmetic. He doesn't want to be doing out loud. He didn't trust us, Roger said finally. It came out smaller than anything Eleanor had heard from him since he was a boy. He trusted you exactly as much as the moment called for, Corbett said, not unkindly. He gave you both a fair split of everything else. The accounts, the car, the general estate. What he protected for your mother specifically. He'd watched a lot of families come through my office over the years, Roger. More than I'd like to count. A good number shows up at a table too early. It changes how everyone treats each other. Before the ink's even dry. Deborah found her voice again, thinner now than walking in. So what happens to the listing? She said. To Harborview. We'd more or less told people. The listing is dead, Corbett said simply. The store was never Roger's to list. As for the house, it was never part of the estate to begin with. There's nothing to unwind. It just returns to the plain fact of who's owned it the whole time. He closed the folder, the small final gesture of a man who said what needed saying and doesn't intend to soften its edges by repeating it. I'd encourage the two of you to speak with your own financial advisor about the mortgage situation, separately from this meeting. That part isn't something a deed correction fixes, Roger asked, voice scraped down to something almost boyish. Whether his mother meant to press any claim against the general estate, for the guest room, the 19 days, any of it. Eleanor understood underneath the question was a genuine fear. A man realizing all at once he'd treated someone with less care than that person had, quietly, all along, deserved. I don't want anything from either of you that isn't already mine, Eleanor said. I want my house. I want my store back open. And I want you both to understand, your father spent 31 years standing behind that register, teaching himself, one Friday at a time, exactly how much a family can survive being handed too soon. He wasn't protecting the house from you boys. He was protecting you boys from the house. Deborah, to her credit, was first to say she was sorry. Clipped, more reflex than reflection. The apology of a woman still doing arithmetic in her head, even as the words left her mouth. Roger said nothing a long moment. Then, quietly, asked if he could see the letter again, just to read it himself. Eleanor handed it across the desk. Ian watched her older son read his father's handwriting with the particular stillness of a man encountering, for the first time in his adult life, proof he'd been thought about more carefully than he'd ever bothered to think about anyone else. The meeting ended a few minutes past 5. No shouting, no dramatic exit, nothing that would make for a satisfying scene in the retelling, except the plain fact of a family walking out of a lawyer's office into a Millhaven evening, with the truth rearranged permanently behind them. Curtis walked his mother to her car, hand light on her shoulder, the way it had been at the funeral. 4 seconds becoming, this time, the whole walk down Main Street. I'm proud of you, Curtis said. I don't think I've said that to you before. I should have. You don't have to say it now either, Eleanor said, though she squeezed his arm before letting go, because 31 years of feeding other people's children had also taught her some things land better, quiet than loud. This was one of them. The unwinding, when it came exactly the way Corbett said it would, without drama. In the plain administrative language of institutions doing what institutions do. The Caldwell County Recorder's Office issued a formal confirmation of both filings within the week. A one-page letter on county letterhead Eleanor kept, eventually, in a drawer at the store rather than framing, because she'd never been a woman who needed a wall to prove a point to herself. Dale Pruitt's firm sent a final, slightly embarrassed email closing the listing file entirely. No further action required, and Rogers Bank, exactly 30 days after Griggs's call, having got no satisfactory update on the inheritance he'd once listed as collateral, called the second mortgage's balance, $48,600 still outstanding, due in full within 90 days. A letter that arrived on a Tuesday. Roger didn't mention it to his mother for nearly 2 weeks, an embarrassment that was, Eleanor suspected, when she finally heard about it from Curtis, its own kind of overdue reckoning. Deborah's sister asked, gently, over the phone, whether the Harbourview condo was still happening. Deborah told her, for the first time in the whole business, something close to the truth. It wasn't. Things had gotten complicated with the estate. She was still figuring out what came next. She didn't name the second deed. Didn't need to. Her sister, who'd lived 2 towns over from Millhaven her whole life, heard things the way small towns hear things. She half knew already. Eleanor moved back into the Ridge House the first Saturday of the following month, carried the same suitcase she'd carried to Millie's 23 days before. It felt lighter this time. Or she felt sturdier. Couldn't entirely tell which. Millie helped carry the green filing box up the porch steps, empty now but for the old inventory sheets, and set it on the kitchen table, where it had sat the first night, back when Eleanor didn't yet know what it held. "You going to keep it?" Millie asked, "or finally throw the thing out?" "Keep it," Eleanor said. "Not junk anymore. Proof he was thinking about me the whole time, even when I didn't know it." The house needed less putting right than Eleanor expected. Deborah hadn't, in the end, cleared the guest room of Walter's files the way she'd promised. The boxes sat exactly as they had the day of the eviction, undisturbed. Told Eleanor something about the actual urgency behind the word clutter she chose, for once. Not to say out loud, she spent 2 days sorting through them anyway. Mostly old hardware invoices, a few photographs she hadn't seen in years. Walter behind the counter in 1994, a moustache he'd shaved off before either son could remember it. Walter and Frank Fenwick splitting a thermos outside the store. Some winter morning decades gone, both laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. The store took longer. Voss Hardware sat closed and locked, going on 2 months by the time Eleanor got the keys, changed back into her name. Shelves dusty. Register drawer empty since Roger cleared it out for what he'd assumed, at the time, was a final inventory before sale. Eleanor stood on the sales floor her first morning back, lights on, looking at the same 2,200 square feet Dale Pruitt had once measured for a fitness studio or a tap room, and thought Walter would have hated both ideas equally. Curtis showed up the following Monday without being asked. Work clothes, not office clothes. Started restocking the nail bins from a supplier catalogue he'd found in Walter's old files. Because Curtis, it turned out, remembered more about the store's actual operations, from summers spent sweeping the floor as a teenager, than either of them had realised. He came most days after that, never mentioned money. Eleanor didn't offer him any beyond a fair wage, once the register started ringing again. She understood, watching him quietly relearn how to price a box of washers. That what he actually wanted was closer to forgiveness, for the 4 seconds at the funeral. The ones he felt hadn't been enough. That kind of debt doesn't settle with a paycheck. Roger's reckoning took longer. Looked from outside considerably less redemptive. He sold the leased car. Replaced it with something older, paid for outright. Eleanor heard about it from Curtis rather than Roger himself, since the two weren't yet speaking easily. He and Deborah refinanced their own house a third time. Terms considerably less generous than the first two. Satisfied the bank's 30-day call. The vending machine route, the whole doomed 40-machine investment, sold off at a loss to a competitor Roger privately suspected had wanted it all along, and simply waited for him to get desperate enough to accept a bad number. The sale itself happened in a diner parking lot 2 counties over. Of all places, Roger signing the transfer papers on the hood of his own car, because the buyer, a man named Deacon Rooney, who ran a larger route out of Erie, didn't see the point in renting an office for a deal this small. Rooney counted out the numbers twice himself before he'd sign, thumbing through 19 $1,000 bills like a man who trusted his own eyes over a bank's paperwork. A detail that struck Roger, standing there in a diner parking lot in October, as almost unbearably ironic, though he didn't say so out loud. "You built this from nothing," Rooney said, not unkindly, folding his copy of the papers into his jacket. "That's worth something, even if the machines never turned a profit. Most guys who try this fold inside a year. You made it 4. Roger thanked him, because there wasn't anything else to say, and drove home with a check in his glove box for $19,000, less than half of the $51,000 he'd originally borrowed to build the route, and he sat in his driveway a long while before going inside, doing the kind of arithmetic that doesn't get easier no matter how many times you run it. He didn't come to the store for nearly 6 weeks. When he finally did, a grey Tuesday, no customers in the aisles, he stood just inside the door a long moment, the little bell above it still swinging. Eleanor, behind the register where his father used to stand, waited without saying anything, because she'd learned 3 weeks living in another woman's guest room that some silences are better left for the other person to break. "I came to apologise," Roger said finally. "Not for a paper, just for the 19 days. For the box. For all of it before the box, honestly, if I'm being straight with myself." He looked around the store, at the shelves Curtis had restocked, at a hand-lettered sign in the window reading "Reopening Saturday," in Eleanor's own careful print. I told myself it was practical. The listing agent, the move, the whole thing. I told myself I was being practical, and you were being sentimental about a house too big for one person. I don't think that's true anymore. I think I just wanted the number to be bigger than it was, and it was easier to believe that if I didn't look too closely at you. Eleanor came around the counter. Not quickly. The way you move in a room where a hurt child needs you to arrive without startling them further. "You're not the first son to do arithmetic before grief," she said. "Your father did some of his own, 4 years before he died, and he didn't tell me either, until I was ready to find it. I'm not interested in punishing you for being human, Roger. I'd like you to be better than you were. That's a different thing." "Can I help?" Roger said, gesturing awkwardly at the shelves. "Curtis says the Saturday order needs a hand unloading." "You can help," Eleanor said. "Start by learning where Dad kept the 10-penny nails. It's not where you'd think. It wasn't forgiveness delivered all at once. Smaller than that. Slower. Built the way the store itself had been built. One Saturday delivery at a time. One restock shelf at a time, across the weeks that followed. Roger came weekends at first, then some weekday evenings, learning a trade he'd spent most of his adult life explaining, at dinner parties 2 towns over, that he'd left behind. Deborah didn't come to the store for months. When she finally did, it was to bring a casserole on the day of the grand reopening, rather than to work a shift. Eleanor accepted it graciously. A woman who's spent 31 years feeding other people's children understands some apologies arrive as food long before they arrive as words. The grand reopening of Voss Hardware fell on a Saturday, in early October. Exactly 1 year, almost to the week, since Walter had rung up a box of 10-penny nails for Harlan Doyle, and then quietly stopped breathing behind his own register. Eleanor thought about that timing a long while before settling on the date. Decided in the end, it felt less like a wound reopened than a debt finally paid on schedule. The way Walter himself would have wanted any account settled. Promptly, without drama. Half the town came through the door that morning. Harlan Doyle drove down from his farm, 40 minutes north. Bought a box of 10-penny nails he almost certainly didn't need. $4.11. Exactly the sum Walter had rung up the morning he died, though neither of them said so out loud. Both of them plainly aware of it anyway. Gripped Eleanor's hand a beat longer than a purchase required. Told her he'd thought about that Tuesday morning every day since. Said it did his heart good, seeing the lights back on. Arlene Meacham came on her lunch break, still in her cardigan, beaded glasses chain, bought a garden trowel she said she'd been needing anyway. $7, counted out in exact change, from a coin purse she'd carried, she told Eleanor, since before either of them worked for a living. Grant Corbett stopped by near noon, not for business, just to stand in the doorway a moment, look at the shelves Curtis had restocked. He nodded once to himself, the way a man nods at a bridge he engineered, glad to see it holding weight. Warren Cassidy drove down from Pittsburgh for it too, though nobody had asked him to, stood at the back near the paint mixer, out of the way, and told Eleanor when she found him there that he'd examined a great many deeds in his career, and almost never got invited to see what one of them actually built, once the paperwork stopped being paper. He bought a coil of picture-hanging wire on his way out, $4, and said he'd hang something at home that had been sitting in a closet, 3 years, waiting for a nail he now, apparently, finally had the right size for. P.T. Ackers came in too, the locksmith who'd changed the front locks and missed the back door. Sheepish about it in a way Eleanor found she didn't have the energy to hold against him. He bought a new deadbolt, told her, blushing slightly, that he'd like to come rekey the whole building properly this time. All 4 doors. No charge. Call it an apology for the one he'd left open by accident. Eleanor let him. Some debts, she was learning, people needed to pay in the currency they actually had, and P.T. Ackers's currency was a good lock, correctly installed. Curtis worked the register most of that day, sharp and quick with the regulars, in a way that reminded more than one old customer of his father at that same age. Roger spent the morning in back, unloading a delivery truck, sleeves rolled up, sweating through a shirt he'd once have considered beneath him, stacking boxes of washers and hinges onto shelves. Still, slowly, learning to read them without a laser or a spreadsheet. Deborah's casserole sat on a folding table near the register, beside a stack of paper plates. By 2 in the afternoon it was gone. She mentioned that to Eleanor twice, quietly pleased. The way a woman rebuilds something, one small offering at a time. Millie held court near the door most of the day, telling anyone who'd stand still the whole story. Or her version of it, embellished a little more with each retelling. By evening, the version circulating the diner had Eleanor discovering the deed by candlelight during a thunderstorm. Eleanor found that when she heard it secondhand from Arlene, more amusing than she let on. Near closing, crowd thinned to a handful of stragglers. Curtis off flipping the sign in the window, Eleanor found a quiet minute alone behind the counter. The same spot where Walter had stood 31 years, where he'd been standing the last ordinary morning of his life. She'd brought the green filing box that morning, empty now of everything but the old inventory sheets, and tucked carefully beneath them, Walter's private ledger, its final entry still visible if you knew to look. She set it on the shelf behind the register, beside a small framed photograph of Walter at that same counter 20 years back, moustache and all, laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. Roger came to stand beside her, closing out the drawer, counting the day's take the way his father had taught him that very afternoon. Twice through before trusting the total. He didn't say anything a while, just watched her hands move through the bills the same unhurried way Walter's always had. He really did count it twice, Roger said finally, echoing, without quite realising it, the same words Eleanor had said to herself in a county records room months before. Every time, Eleanor said, even when he already knew the answer. She squared the last bills into the drawer, slid it shut. The small, definite click of a register that had finally, after a long silence, gone back to balancing exactly the way it was supposed to. Outside, October light going long and gold across Front Street, catching the new paint on the window where Curtis had lettered Voss Hardware. Established 1993. Reopened, beneath the old sign nobody had ever taken down. The months after settled into something Eleanor hadn't expected to feel so soon after the funeral. An ordinary rhythm. She opened the store most mornings at 7, the way Walter always had, closed most evenings at 6. In between, sold nails and paint and garden hose to a town that had, in its own quiet way, decided to root for her. The way small towns sometimes do when they've watched a wrong get set right without anyone having to raise their voice about it. Roger's reckoning with the bank took the better part of that winter to fully settle. He and Deborah sold the late condo plans entirely, put the second refinance behind them at terms that pinched but held, moved that spring into a smaller house 2 streets from Millie's bungalow, closer to the Ridge house than they'd lived in years, which Eleanor noticed and chose to read as something other than coincidence. Roger came to the store 3, sometimes 4 days a week by then. Not for money, Eleanor paid him fairly. Not generously, but because he'd discovered, somewhere in that long unravelling winter, that he preferred a trade where the arithmetic was honest, where a box of nails cost exactly what it cost, and nobody's whole identity depended on convincing someone else otherwise. Brittany, of all people, became the store's most unlikely regular, came by most Saturdays that spring, ostensibly to help unload deliveries for spending money, though Eleanor suspected the real draw was the framed photograph behind the register, the young Walter with the moustache, and the stories Curtis told her about a grandfather she'd barely known before he was gone. She asked Eleanor once, stacking paint cans by colour, why nobody in the family had ever told her grandpa was so funny. Eleanor said that was a fair question, and the answer probably had more to do with the family than with Walter. Deborah's change was the slowest and in some ways the most complete. She started coming Wednesdays that summer, not with food this time, to actually work a shift at the register, learning the trade the way her husband had. Awkward at first, overcharging a regular for washers, before Curtis gently corrected her, then over weeks with something like real competence. She never fully apologised in words for the guest room, for the Friday that kept sliding, for the mediator's folder set so lightly beside a water glass. Eleanor had stopped needing the words by then, watching Deborah count a drawer twice before trusting the total. The exact habit Walter had spent 31 years teaching, without ever once explaining why it mattered so much. One Wednesday that fall, closing out a slow afternoon together, Deborah came up $11 short on the draw and spent 40 minutes retracing every sale rather than simply writing it off, the way she once might have. She found it eventually a customer she'd undercharged for a length of chain by exactly that amount, and drove 8 miles to his farm that evening to collect it properly, refusing his offer to just let it go. You didn't have to do that, Eleanor told her when she got back, the $11 set carefully in the till. I did actually, Deborah said. I spent a long time thinking small numbers didn't matter if the big ones worked out. Turns out that's exactly backwards. The big ones only work out because somebody minds the small ones first. She closed the drawer. I think I finally understand what your husband was doing, counting that thing twice every single Friday for 31 years. It was never really about the money being wrong. It was about proving to himself every week that he was still the kind of man who'd notice if it was. It was Harlan Doyle who gave Eleanor the idea, without meaning to, sometime that same summer. He came in on a slow Tuesday, the way he always did, and stood a long moment at the counter before finally admitting that the farm had had a hard spring, a late frost that took half his seed corn, somewhere near $3,000 of it by his own rough count, and that he might need to run a small tab through the summer if that was still something the store did. Eleanor thought of the old ledger entry, Curtis's discovery months before. Pruitt's on a fixed income. Let it ride till spring. Don't mention it to him. She thought of her husband's handwriting, careful and certain, deciding quietly, without ceremony, that some accounts were worth carrying a while. Of course, it's still something the store does, Eleanor said. Your father-in-law bought his first tractor on credit from this store, Harlan, back before either of us were running it. Some things don't change just because the name behind the counter did. She started a small notebook after that, kept separate from the register, a private ledger of her own the way Walter had kept his. Not tracking profit. Tracking who needed the winter carried a little longer than the invoice said. She never told Roger or Curtis about it directly, though Curtis found it eventually, the way you find things in a business you've started paying real attention to, and he never said a word about it either, just quietly made sure the numbers in it always balanced come spring. By the following year, 3 families in Mill Haven had, at one point or another, run a tab at Voss Hardware. $70 here, $200 there, once as much as $340 for a family rebuilding a porch after a windstorm, that Eleanor never pressed too hard about collecting. And all 3, in their own time, paid it forward the way small towns eventually do, one bringing over a truckload of firewood, the winter Eleanor's own furnace acted up, another sending their teenage son to shovel the store's walk every snow that year, without ever once being asked or paid. There was a Sunday that following autumn, almost exactly a year after the dinner with the mediator's folder, when the whole family gathered again at the Ridge House, this time at Eleanor's invitation, this time without an agenda hidden under the tablecloth. Eleanor made the same apple pie she always made. Roger carved a chicken he'd actually roasted himself, badly, dry at the edges, and everyone ate it anyway, and told him it was fine, which it nearly was. Before dinner, Roger had asked to say something, standing at the head of the table the way his father used to before a meal, a habit nobody in the family had picked back up since the funeral, until that evening. I want to say the number out loud, he said, because Mum taught me that's the only honest way to say anything, with a $sign attached to it. I owe this family, in one way or another, somewhere close to $100,000 of trouble I made for myself, and nearly let land on someone who didn't deserve a cent of it. I'm not there yet, paying it back, but I wanted you all to hear me say the actual number, not a smaller, easier one. Nobody applauded, nobody needed to. Curtis reached over and squeezed his brother's shoulder once, the way Eleanor had squeezed his arm outside Corbett's office a year before, and that was the whole of the family's response, which was, everyone at the table understood without saying so. Exactly enough. Brittany asked to see the green filing box again. Eleanor brought it out after dinner and let her hold Walter's private ledger, turning its cracked spine carefully, reading the last entry out loud to the table herself. Paid in full, 4 years early, and it's hers now. Every board of it. Nobody at that table needed it explained anymore, what any of it had cost or what it had bought. Eleanor kept one small habit from those hard weeks she never fully gave up, even once the store was steady, and the family had found its new quieter footing. Every Friday evening, closing out the register, she counted the drawer twice before trusting the total. Not because she distrusted the number. Some habits outlive the reason you started them and become instead simply the way you stay close to a person who isn't there to do it with you anymore. She locked the front door herself one more evening, that October, the anniversary of the reopening, and stood a moment on the sidewalk with her sons on either side of her. One still learning, still awkward with a laser measure Curtis had finally taught him to use for something other than a stranger's listing. One already sure, sharp with the regulars the way his father had been. Both finally standing where their father had always hoped they'd end up standing. Down the block, Millie's porch light came on, the way it did most evenings now, a small steady signal Eleanor had come to read, the way sailors read a lighthouse. Not because she needed rescuing anymore, but because it was good some nights to know exactly where the safe harbour sat, in case she ever did again. Behind them, in the window, the little framed photograph caught the last of the light, Walter still laughing at whatever the camera never caught, and Eleanor thought, walking her sons to their separate cars in the cooling dark, that she had finally, after everything, gotten the accounting exactly right. Not the dollars. Those had only ever been the register, and registers, she'd learned longer ago than tonight, are the easy part to balance. The real total had always been standing right here on a sidewalk in a town called Millhaven, 2 grown sons on either side of her instead of neither, counted twice, the slow, careful way Walter had taught her without ever once explaining why, and come out, at long last even,